Welcome, everybody, to the 7th episode of our wonderful podcast, ABT Time, which ordinarily would be on Wednesday afternoon, 3 o'clock in California, afternoon teen time here, which corresponds to 8 a.m. in Melbourne, morning tea time at the University of Melbourne, where my co-host, formerly Australian correspondent, now upgraded to co-host, even though she's not going to be with us today, Jen Martin would be joining us. So today we will not have that wonderful female voice that normally accompanies me. It's just going to be 3 white dudes, and please bear with us because ordinarily we have lots of women on the show, but this one's a different little one. These are 2 of my film school classmates. I will be bringing them in a few minutes, introducing them to you, but a few little things to start with. And a week from, on June 9th, so next Wednesday, we will be running our Narrative Blitz again. And this time we'll run it in the morning from 11 California to 1:30 in the afternoon. Then we'll have the podcast episode where Jen and I will kind of do a postmortem. We might even have on a few of the speakers from the Narrative Blitz. It was such a big hit in April. We had 1,500 people sign up for it. And so we're running it again, pretty much the same thing. We may add one new video to that. The following week, we're going to talk about overfishing and the documentary Seaspiracy. And I'm having on 2 of my good friends that are experts on the overfishing issue, Jennifer Jacquet from NYU and John Hocevar from Greenpeace. That's going to be a very in-depth discussion. The week after that will be a special we'll do on teaching the ABT. But for today, we are going to dive into the usual sort of narrative structure type stuff, ABTs type stuff, what you've come to expect in this podcast, but also going to have with me 2 of my film school classmates from the University of Southern California. As a matter of fact, why don't we just bring them on right now? And with a warning, these may be obstreperous guests. I thought they were going to be wonderful until yesterday. We were trading text messages late last night. And the next thing I know, they both start giving me all kinds of pushback and resistance on what is this thing about? What are we going to talk about? So, all right, Jason and Greg, are you there? Go ahead and activate your cameras and microphones and join me and be as pleasant and wonderful as humanly possible or not. There they are.
I think is the key there, Randy.
My old buddies. So this is a bit of a reunion in some ways. In other ways, there's nothing reunion-like about this, given that over the past 25 years of my life, believe it or not, I have probably spent more time talking to these 2 individuals than anybody else I know. I got a feeling
for you.
I know it's kind of shocking, isn't it? So I thought we would just begin. I got to warm them up a little bit, get them comfortable here. They're terrified. This is just going to be a nerd cast. Jason Ensler and Greg Tillman. You guys remember this? This is the old walkway between the 2 main buildings that used to exist there. They're long gone. The George Lucas building and the Marcia Lucas building had this little walkway that someone had carved into the cement down there. You can see the motto of USC Cinema School, reality ends here. And we spent a lot of time hanging out on that walkway there and around the film school during our 3 wonderful years, which began in spring of 94. Jason and I were in the same class in the production program at USC that consisted of 50 students going through for 3 years together. As I said, Greg was the semester before us. In our class of 50 students, there was, all this speculation about wonder which person here is going to be the one that turns out 25 years from now to be the real superstar that just dominates Hollywood. It turns out Jason won the prize in our class. He is the guy that I think by everybody's definition ended up being the most successful in Hollywood filmmaking. Today, he is kind of in a handful of the top television directors in Hollywood and big cheese in recent years. He's co-executive produced TV series with Steven Spielberg and Ridley Scott and all kinds of folks. And I think within Greg's class, he's certainly in the top group as well. He has become a major writer, director, producer for Discovery Channel and Netflix. He directed a season of Dirty Jobs a few years ago. Last year, he was the editor and I think producer on probably one of my top 5 all-time documentaries in all seriousness. Wonderful documentary called Operation Odessa that you can watch on Netflix right now. It's become very popular there. It's a crazy story about three gangster mobsters sort of in Miami who brokered a deal between the Colombian cartel trying to buy a submarine, a full military submarine from Russia and the breakdown of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Just a crazy, crazy film that I got updates all along the way as Greg was editing it over the course of a year and a half or so. And it's a wonderful film. And then this year he was, I think, executive producer on co-executive producer on Night Stalker, which was #1 for how many weeks there on Netflix?
I don't know, a few.
Yeah. So one of those true crime dramas. Okay. That is our little intro to get us oriented here. Now it's time to get down to business because we're here to try and talk about some substantive things. And by the way, Matt read Bruce Bloch's book in the last few days, so he's going to join us eventually with a few questions as we move along, and not clear exactly what we're going to talk about. But what I want to dive into a little bit was, in film school at USC, we had a weird mix there of some really crummy instructors and then some absolute, geniuses that were masterpieces. And of all of them, I think these are probably two of the most memorable and most super duper important. So on the left, you see Frank Daniel, who's one of the great gurus of screenwriting, and he died in our second year in 1996. But I had his class. Did both of you guys take his script analysis course? Jason did. Greg did not. Yeah. So you've been part of those discussions we've had in recent years. Frank Daniel gave rise to a whole model called the sequence paradigm model. He had a very analytical mind that really distinguished him, I think, when it came to screenwriting. And he is the source of the ABT. We'll talk about that. That's where it comes from originally. And then on the right is Bruce Bloch, who is still teaching at USC, is really become iconic. That's a picture of him with, Frank Daniel's with Robert Redford, because Frank Daniel was the artistic director at the Sundance Institute for 10 years, I believe. Bruce Bloch is there with George Lucas, and Lucas is a huge part of the USC Cinema School. Bruce had already been teaching for 7 or 8 years there and already established his course on visual expression when all three of us took it. I'm sure Greg and I were partners in that course along with Adam Timrud. And then Jason, you had Bruce Bloch's course, I'm sure, right?
Oh yeah.
So these two are really a great combination because Bruce Bloch, his course was visual expression, and there's two main elements to making a film that works. There's the visual elements that you tell a story with, and then there's the story that you tell. And without both doing a good job with both of those, you really don't manage to take advantage and do much with the whole medium. So it's fitting that we would take a look at what we've learned from these two guys over the years and thoughts like that. Why don't we just start with Jason? Why don't you talk about Bruce Bloch's course and the impact it's had on you, as well as, I don't know how many parties I've been at over the years of USC students standing around talking about it. As soon as you say Bruce Bloch, it's just it's a brand, basically, right?
Yeah, pretty much. What Bruce Bloch taught us and me specifically, just in terms of my own personal experience, trying to implement and execute a lot of his ideas, is that, and this isn't really part of the class, but it is a function of what you learn in the class, which is that there's so much politics and so much noise and so many distractions and so many interpersonal sort of negotiations that go on when you're working on a film set. And what Bruce provided were these 7 visual elements that you control regardless of all of that. So despite anything that's going on in the real life of the making of the thing, when you go back to the script and you talk and you create an arc with line or movement or space or tone, suddenly that's your private jurisdiction as the director. Nobody's getting involved with that. Yes, you're communicating it to the DP and you're paving a path through the material and creating sort of visual language that's yours based on the tools that he's given you. But it's the one place that you're safe. It's the one place that you can go to where nobody gets in your way. So to this day, I go back to Bruce Bloch anytime I'm in trouble. And even when I'm not in trouble, when I'm just prepping, I'm with Bruce Bloch. And then when I'm in trouble, I call upon the spirit of Bruce Bloch to save me because because first of all, nobody else on set is interested in the visual elements that you're employing to make the narrative, to elevate the narrative. You start talking to them about the Bruce Block stuff and they glaze over, which is great because now I can geek out on it with me and my DP and my camera operator, and we can talk about lenses and lighting and color and arcs and employ all of these things, and nobody bothers us. So it's a very safe space.
Okay, let me jump in with a couple of comments here, because in this first third, it's going to be Bruce Block, and this is going to be mostly Jason, not so much Greg. And then the next bunch is going to be more on writing, which I think is maybe going to be a little bit more on Greg, because I'm going to ask you to talk about the Corey Mandel stuff and those kinds of things. And so then in terms of Bruce Block stuff, I thought that course was incredible. In the 25 years since then, I think I've used about 1.8% of the time I've made use of his stuff. I just have not had the luxury of being deep enough into filmmaking. I made a few films that were kind of scrappy, but really didn't get the chance to implement it. I know that you have a ton, Jason. That's why I want to hear a lot more about how you do on the practical side of what you're just talking about right now. In between is Greg, how much do you feel like, like when you did Dirty Jobs, you weren't able to work with the DP on visual arcs and things like that, where or when have you found yourself over the years drawing on Bruce Block type stuff?
Well, when you're doing documentary stuff, you're just scrambling. You're just trying to collect stuff and then figure it out later on, kind of thing. Whereas Jason gets the luxury of sitting down and making a plan. I've listened to Jason talk about writing up lookbooks and presenting things to producers about what the show is going to look like, and it seems to me like that stuff has just made you really powerful, Jason. Like people have before the show even starts, it's like, man, this guy is in control. Like you do a lot of work before anything starts shooting, and a lot of it has to do with this kind of stuff, and it's given you a big chunk of power, it seems like to me.
Have you done some of that, Greg, in any of your pitches, things like that, or it's still just,
I'm working on a sizzle right now for a new show, and it's one of the first times where I talked to Jason about it a little bit, and he showed me some stuff that he's done, and it's one of the first times that I've really started to employ some of that stuff, because so much of this is about figuring it out as you go along when you're doing a documentary series or a documentary. Whereas, sometimes a good doc is really planned out ahead of time, but not nearly as much as a feature or a scripted show, the kind of stuff that Jason does.
And another kind of setup comment here in this discussion and how it relates to this podcast and the audience that we've got, because we do have an audience of people that have taken the ABT framework course for starters. A lot of them are science and conservation folks who haven't been to film school, but everybody's making films and videos nowadays, just about everybody in one way or another. And especially in the past year with the pandemic, everybody on Zoom, you're basically a filmmaker of sorts on Zoom. And if there's any one central point that I want this 1 hour to kind of bring to bear, is that there's so much to making a good film, to really doing it well, and that's a lot of what they open our minds up to in film school, and especially Bruce Block's course, like these 7 elements, 7 visual elements. You sat there like, I didn't know there's all these things they could do. I literally, some of those films, one of the things he would do in that class was he would show us a movie once, and then he'd show it the second time with the audio turned off. And he would point out, look at what they're doing here. Look at what the cinematographer's done. I remember the sequence in Ordinary People and the whole visual progression there that built with the scenes in the psychiatrist's office, and how eventually the whole color scheme changed, which you didn't notice unless you had an instructor there turning off the audio and pointing out these things that are changing. But they are changing, and they're somewhat subliminal, but they are powerful like that. And as you see that stuff, you realize, wow, there's this enormous world of resources of which most filmmakers are only utilizing a tiny little bit of that. Is that not true, Jason? Do you see so few people really tapping into all the different channels of communication you're doing potentially in a film?
Most filmmakers don't even understand that they have that control at their disposal. When I hire directors, some of them get it, and some of them I will mention something to this effect, or I'll even cite the Ordinary People, the arc of the 6 therapy scenes, right? Which was, he comes to therapy at the same time each session, but it's the fall equinox into the winter solstice that changes the light and reflects his inner emotional and their intimacy, the intimacy with the psychiatrist. I start talking about that to people and they're like, what? You can do what? You can, they just think, so a lot of directors think it's about showing up, bossing people around, hosing it down and being in charge. And that's almost none of it.
Well, it's a lot of it. I mean, I've edited a lot of television, and that's a lot of television directors. It's about speed and getting through it and being an authority and getting it done. But in terms of greatness, Coppola knew what he was doing with this stuff. You don't make The Godfather and have it last the way that it has unless he knew and understood this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, can I go back for a second because I wanted to make
of course.
a point to Greg, which is I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that there is the prep part of the Bruce Block application, and then there is the sort of intrinsic sort of learned intuition when you're shooting, where you're choosing compositions and you don't even realize that you're choosing compositions because they're communicating an emotional value of some kind, because all composition is intent anyway. You can't make a frame and not have some kind of effect, even if you don't make a choice. You're still making a choice. Sure. So I don't know. I think that there is something that in 25 years since film school, at least for me as a shooter, when I'm on set, even if I haven't prepped it with that kind of idea in mind, I can trust that the muscle is there to choose the right lenses, to choose the right composition, so that the story either has shape, structure, or I'm subjectively capturing the emotion of the character I'm shooting.
Have you ever ended up with cinematographer or somebody important on the set who was also took Bruce Block's class and you could instantly speak the language with him?
Byron Shaw.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, I've hired him for 10 projects, and a large part of the reason is because we have this shorthand. When we're talking lenses and color and space and flat space and limited space, there's no delay. We just get through it. And we know
he was in Greg's class, right? So
yep.
Semester before us, right? Exactly. And so yeah, you learned the same language with him, and that gives a huge head start on it all.
I think that is right, that once you absorb that stuff, you can, intuition takes over. But at the end of the day, you're probably never going to get a documentary that looks like A Little Princess, which was another movie that Bruce Block showed us, which was just so incredibly controlled from start to finish.
Sure. Yeah.
Give us some specifics from Little Princess. What sorts of elements did you see there that were so controlled?
Oh my God, the color, was just unbelievable from start to finish. And it went from drab green to those incredibly bright colors. I don't know if anybody remembers that movie, but it's about a little girl whose father has disappeared, and she's in Victorian England. She's trapped in maybe it's America, but she's some orphanage, and by the end of it, it's just bright colors and life and orange, but it was all the way through. He used that film to kind of express everything he was talking about. I think, right? Just about every element.
He did, and Full Metal Jacket and Ordinary People, and I'm trying to remember.
Well, yeah, like Jason, when you talk this language with people, what are the main films that you draw on that you find everybody's kind of got some understanding of?
Well, it depends on the genre. If I'm like when I was auditioning, did I audition? When I was interviewing for The Exorcist, I'm able to look at films now.
Wait, hang on. The Exorcist, the Fox TV, was it?
The Fox TV show, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I don't want anybody to get confused.
I'm not William Friedkin. When I was interviewing for that, it's just learning the source material. What happens is once you have the Bruce Block in your head, you watch movies with an eye towards finding it, whether he cited it or not, because those visual rules are malleable, and it's not just those 7. You find 7 more as you go, in terms of, or whatever, that's an arbitrary number, but there are other elements in terms of connection and disconnection and distortion and duality and identity that overlap with what he's talking about. and then you start to see it in other films, and then you start taking ideas from other films and sort of cross-pollinating them into whatever I'm pitching on or making.
So in his awesome book, The Visual Story,
Mhm.
which you can see all my little Post-it notes, and I intimidated the two of you yesterday with all my notes on it. But, you know, a few little quotes from there. One section, he talks about progressions. Good picture making always has used progressions. Progressions are fundamental to story or musical structure, and they're fundamental to visual structure. Talk about progressions a little bit. Is that always in your mind with stories? Start with Jason.
Can you be more, what do you mean? I mean, yes, you're always looking for movement, right? You never want to put your foot in the same river twice. You always, even as Gordon Willis, when he was talking about shots, you know, each shot is a brick with new information that you're stacking on top of another brick. You know, the problem with coverage in television is you can very easily, and because of the rhythm of the cutting, and there's nothing lands because it's all the same information and there's no differentiation. Nothing is specific, and so when you're specific, you notice the movement in story. You notice what was it Paul Lucy used to call scene polarity, right? Where if a scene starts negative, it should end positive, and if it's not a scene, then it's a sequence. And vice versa, positive to negative, negative to positive. There's always some kind of transition, even if it's in one of the characters' point of view. And so when you start seeing the movement in story, you start representing it visually. So, or maybe, I mean, I don't know if the cart's before the horse, because sometimes you have a visual idea, or what I like to call an anchor frame, a frame that's not part of the coverage, that suddenly with one composition, you tell the whole story of the scene. And you kind of, you know, you want to be as organic as possible, but you kind of reverse engineer the scene or the blocking so that anchor frame appears, so that the story is told, right? And when you're doing that, sometimes you start to see the movement in story because of the visual idea that you had. Sometimes you see the movement in story because of the script, and then you apply the visuals to convey that movement, that arc, that polarity.
So you directed episodes of really some of the A+ shows, The West Wing and Newsroom, HBO, and just a lot of those high level shows. When you get up to those highest levels, do you find more interest in time and resources and respect for visual structuring versus lower budget things where they're just running as fast as they can?
Yeah, and you find it on all levels. You find it in the actors, you find it in the crew. You know, everybody knows they're working on something that has some, I mean, I don't want to say importance, because that sounds falutin, but there is an awareness that you're working on something of quality, and that the story that you're telling requires a certain level of excellence. And when you get to the expectation of that excellence, and you start talking about, I'm going to do this act in flat space, and then, you know, the monster's going to appear, and then we're going to be in deep space, people go, yeah, that's awesome. That's going to be great. The audience is going to feel that. So there's more geeking out on those kinds of productions where, you know, if you think about all the movies that moved you, and made you cry and made you laugh and made you shudder and fright, you know, you can break that down now with like visual effects artists and special effects, and you can dissect it. But the one thing you can't dissect is that sort of human emotion, the effect of how a reductive scene made you feel something. And what the Bruce Block model does, and what all of this, the sort of visual language that you can control, is it starts to allow us to dissect how to get an emotion out of, you know, how to make the audience feel something.
Okay, so earlier I was talking about this model that we use in the ABT framework course of just very simply the inner circle and the outer circle. And then there's this third element that we've, Patty Limerick, a famous historian who's part of the course, has talked about the history of the fool and the idea of what we call the official fool, somebody who comes in who doesn't know your content, but knows the form and can ask these really important questions where their brain's not clouded up by all the content. So in the spirit of telling you that you were the quote fool for me in film school, We have our quote fool who joined us for a moment there. Hopefully we'll come back. My co-host, Jen, are you there? Apparently she got a break in her commitments. Have you got a fool type of question to ask these two guys in the world of filmmaking that you know nothing about what you're talking about?
Geez, Randy, good morning. That's a bit of a harsh beginning. Hi, Jason. Hi, Greg. I've just joined you. I have no idea what you've been discussing. So
Perfect.
how would I even know what the full question is?
Force them to justify everything they're saying.
Oh, look, you're putting me on the spot now. I don't know. Obviously, the clear question is, how do I make a blockbuster movie? I mean, what else would I want to know at this point?
There you go.
Let me ask you something, Jen. What is a movie that really affected you emotionally that you really loved?
Oh, probably a movie that you guys will have never heard of, I think. It's an Australian movie from a long time ago now called Till Human Voices Wake Us. And it was with Guy Pearce and Helena Bonham Carter. And it was one of those movies that you just weren't really clear what was happening quite a lot of the time. Have you ever heard of it?
No. So now at least I have a movie that I'm going to go watch after this podcast. So that's cool. But I was just going to, I assumed that maybe it would be a film that we'd all heard of, and then we would talk about it in terms that we're dealing with here. But
can you take another shot? Something that we Americans have heard of?
Okay, well, this is gonna belie my mainstream, very
Titanic.
my very mainstream addiction. No, well, my family's all into Harry Potter. I've read the Harry Potter series to my kids aloud. I've read it to myself. We're all deeply in Harry Potter world, and we spend a lot of time talking about the movie adaptations and where they failed and where they didn't. So really happy to talk Harry Potter movies anytime you like.
Jason, you got to think Bruce Block Control is all over those movies, right?
Well, certainly, yes, in terms of color and lensing and space, absolutely. I'm not as familiar with these. I mean, I know the first few, and then I stopped.
I figured that I'd come off in a pretty bad light, the fact that I didn't stop.
I do think big budget movies that have a lot of money and a lot of they take the time to do the stuff that we're talking about, that Jason's talking about. One way or the other, you don't usually get a movie that's got $100 million into it that hasn't got a lot of control over the visuals, there's a progression, and
it's for the sake of our non-filmmaker viewers, explain what you mean by that phrase, control over the visuals. Jason,
go ahead.
Well, okay. There are, when you add the ingredients of an image together in terms of the production design, the lighting, the lensing, the movement of the actors, the movement of the camera, the sense of space, the sense of focus fall off, what's in focus, what's not, the sense of whether or not the characters are one with their environment or contrasting their environment. All of those things add up together in one single frame to tell you a story. And when you are doing narrative filmmaking, you have control over those elements, and you spend months, well, weeks in my case, working with your production designer, your art director, your DP, your costume designer. You're having color meetings. You're having meetings about lensing. When you're ordering special equipment, you're doing lens tests to make sure that you're getting the kind of look that you're going for, whether it's an intimate character drama or something with epic scope. It changes the aspect ratio. It changes the size of the image. So all of these decisions are being made to capture the story in, how do I say this, to create the illusion that it is happening in some way, shape, or form before your eyes, and so that the suspension of disbelief is there, and you are completely immersed. It's about immersion, and I know that in your ABT model, it's always about like, what's making the audience lean in, what's making them want to know what happens next. Well, it's the same thing when we approach the visuals. Where am I leading the eye, and how am I making sure that no one takes their eyes off these images?
And how important is color in that?
Very.
How important?
Well, it's very important because it's the easiest. It's like music in a way. It goes like right to your heart. It goes right to your optic nerve. It goes right to your, color. Color is more understandable. It's also the easiest as a filmmaker to control versus controlling space or line or movement. I mean, that's much more sophisticated. Controlling color is one of the first things you do, and you just keep refining. Sometimes you give characters certain colors. Sometimes you deny colors. In the passage, we didn't use the color red, except for the blood that the virals were drinking, and we used it in the virals flashbacks as a foreshadowing that they would become virals who drank blood, and that was the only time we used red. So the absence of color it can be as powerful as the presence of color if you use it correctly.
And I'll just offer myself up as the idiot guinea pig and my whole progression. I began film school, straight out of the science world with this very doubting, skeptical science mind, negating everything. And second semester in 508, we had the recently departed Judy Irola was my camera instructor. And she was a very good production designer. And so she gave us a little exercise and showed us stuff. And I remember showing us a clip one day of some feature film, and it was at a landfill, and it was a pan across the landfill and kind of gloomy landscape. And then she stopped it and pointed out all these orange trash bags that were in the landfill. And she said, those are not there by coincidence. Those were put there by the production designer. And I sat there thinking, oh, no, not really, really. That was one of my moments of realizing, wait, you mean that color that I'm looking on the screen, somebody's actually been fiddling with it, and not just fiddling, but with a purpose. And it takes a while to absorb that you're messing with the brains of the audience through color, through the controlled use of color and those sorts of things. And then eventually I took Bruce Bloch's course, and that's where he leads you really deep into seeing the depth of all this sort of stuff. One of the things flipping through his book last night, what was that movie Up in the Air with George Clooney? That wasn't a great movie. He used it a couple of times in there as examples, and so some of these movies, they expend a lot of effort on visual elements in a movie that was a little bit like, who cares? But nevertheless, as you say, they're always there working on that sort of stuff, and it is present there, and it is at the core of it all. And that's to get back, Jen, I had said early on, part of the point of this discussion is for people making films. I run into a lot of these science video makers now calling themselves filmmakers, and you get the feeling they think they know what they're doing. And listen to these veterans say even they most of the time don't entirely know what they're doing. I mean, there's so much. That's what they open our minds up to in film school, is look at all these channels that you can be communicating through, and just depth of field perspective, 3-point perspective, all these kinds of things. They're all going on during a movie. And I think this kind of leads us to our segue into the other big element, which is story structure. And that's, of course, at the core of the ABT that we're working on. So Frank Danielle, you see on the other side there, those two photos, he was the guy who really, I think he's the original source of the ABT. And there's this quote that I use endlessly in my books. It was Marty Kaplan in the Annenberg School at USC knew Frank, and he found this speech from 1986 that he sent to me. And in there are these two paragraphs in which Frank said, monotony is a problem in first drafts. There are several reasons for it. One usually is the fact that the scenes follow in the forbidden pattern of and then. And that's the and structure that we boiled down to and identified. There's your enemy. There's your non-narrative monotonic and structure. He went on to say, in such a case, immediately you have monotony. In a dramatic story, the pattern usually for the connecting scenes is and then, but, therefore, but, and towards the culmination, meanwhile. If you don't have this but and therefore connection between the parts, the story becomes linear, monotonous. Diaries and chronicles are written that way, but not scripts. And what I say to the science people is that scientific laboratory journals are written that way. And here's everything went on in the lab. But your actual papers, when you get them published, you can't write them that way. You have to undergo the exact same transition that he's talking about there. So the wisdom in that little quote in 1986, and I think the thing that's kind of stunning, if you think about it, for the three of us, we went through film school 94 to 97, and no one ever talked to us, as far as I never heard anybody talk to us. I had at least 4 or 5 different writing courses. No one ever talked about that and but therefore simple dynamic for story structure, nor did anybody talk about Joseph Campbell. I think there was just the beginnings of an awakening of realizing how important Joseph Campbell's work is. I eventually heard about the and but therefore dynamic from the South Park guys in 2011 when they mentioned it in a documentary. And I think the way that they picked up on it was Frank Daniel gave rise to a lot of very bright students. Just like in the academic world, you get these famous professors and you can follow their lineage of all their PhD students that go off and become professors elsewhere. And that knowledge kind of goes down through these branches. And the same thing went on with Frank Daniel. He is the text. I think that passage there, as far as I can tell, was the start of this understanding of the and but therefore dynamic, which is becoming more formalized. And that's, of course, at the core of all that we do. And towards that end, poor old Greg has had to listen to 7 or 8 or 9 years of me pounding and but therefore into his head. And nowadays, Greg, how much do you make use of and but therefore?
Never. I never even think about it.
And this is where it all falls apart. Complete discrediting of me. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to get to this moment where I can embarrass you in front of all of your fans. It's all been leading up to this, just waiting.
Zippo.
The longest joke I've ever planned. No, I more and more I use it. I think about it a lot, and as I said to you, I think recently, it's just like, it's one of those things, like when you first started talking to me about this, I kind of was just like, yeah, whatever. Okay, that's interesting. But over the years, it's started to kind of crystallize in my head, and it's gone from an intuitive thing to sort of really seeing it in the doc stuff that I'm doing. And a lot of time when I'm editing things now in documentaries, I'm working to put them into an ABT format. Because a lot of times people will say something that's an ABT, but they won't phrase it exactly that way, which makes it less clear than it could be. And with just a little bit of tweaking here and there, I can just pull a but from somewhere else and what someone's saying and replace a so or an and when it really is a but. They're making a turn. They're saying something else, something changed what I was doing, so I had to think something else, and I drop it in, and everything becomes more clear and more interesting.
And you've told me about that before. This is in documentary editing where you actually put together a little bin full of buts that you can then copy and paste into the middle where somebody didn't say but you're adding it in there in their voice, and it strengthens the structure right there. I think that's just so fascinating, just so true. I mean,
and it's so familiar for us, isn't it, Randy? Because I find a lot of scientists somehow believe that the word "but" isn't an appropriate word to use. Somehow they feel it's not formal enough, so they always want to use howevers or despites. Right. And when you can just turn it back into a simple "but," suddenly everything clicks into place and it's clear. But people avoid using the word "but."
Yeah, they do. And a guy from the political world sent me an article recently with some communications expert recommending never use the word but. And I just wrote back and said, anybody who says that just doesn't understand narrative structure. I mean, that
was me. I sent that to you, Randy, because this guy was saying he's a comms expert. And he said, but is a danger word. We should never use the word but. And I'm like, well, I love that word.
Yeah, exactly. No, this was just last week from a political consultant that sent it to me. Same basic thing. And that's my answer was, well, that's just a person who doesn't understand narrative structure. They haven't been to film school. They haven't made films, because when you go through that realm, you begin to see this stuff from a different perspective, and you see the importance of defining this structure. Jason, you live and breathe narrative structure.
Well, hold on. I have a question. Are they talking about it in terms of communicating a message, or are they talking about it in terms of their own sort of personal diplomacy? Because I would agree that but has the same effect in personal correspondence as it does in narrative structure, which is it creates tension. And sometimes when you're talking to someone, you don't want the but, because you're sort of you're undoing what you've already said if you're trying to make a point. It's sort of like the pleasantries of a difficult conversation. Pleasantries, but what I really want to talk about is this, and then it's the
absolutely. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I did my story circles training with a group of diplomats from the State Department in DC, about 15 of them for the day. And they pointed out at the beginning of the day, we're told from day one, never use the word but in diplomacy, for exactly what you're saying there, because it is such a harsh word, so attention getting. And guess what? Guess who was the one guy who used the hell out of the word but? Donald Trump. And it's in all of his speeches, and his proportionate use of the word but is higher than any politician I've found of any, large sample size of speeches. That was him. He didn't care about diplomacy. He cared about beating you over the head as quickly as possible. And look where it got him. But that is exactly the dynamic. And there are these alternate words of however, and that's what diplomacy is talking indirectly around the point so that you can maintain agreement and not have divides like that. Greg, were you going to say something?
Well,
Andy, that's also exactly what came out with our improv discussion. You want it to be yes and, because you want to be leading forward. You don't want to be shutting it down with a but. But we know that in the right place, a but changes everything.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to, but in terms of telling a good story, at least in documentaries, but introduces a problem. So you have a series of status quos that keep getting interrupted by problems that create drama and something that needs to be overcome. And then it is, and then you introduce another problem and another problem and another problem on the way towards achieving whatever your ultimate goal is in that story. So it's, you don't want to use that word when you're trying to negotiate with someone probably, but if you did, and you were watching it on screen, it'd be a much more interesting conversation than if someone was being very diplomatic. If someone was using the word but, there's going to be a problem, and that's more interesting than watching someone be very diplomatic.
Well, and Greg, let me get you to say a few more words about, USC Film School. We spent 3 years there. I had 4 or 5 writing courses. Years later, I came to realize they were really bad. The courses that I had there, anything to do with writing, they were unbelievably bad, really, because they were mostly hands off. Like, you guys go ahead and start your script, and then every night we'll get together and talk about these things. And the instructors I had didn't do much to guide the discussion. I remember sitting there listening to these people, horrible scripts. In later years, other people began explaining to me about Joseph Campbell, something I never heard about at all there. And it was 15 years after film school that I began to soak in narrative structure, how important it is. That, to their credit, they did sort of the first few weeks we were there in our orientation, people talked about little catchphrases like story will out. I remember in our orientation, there was one guy who talked to us, an older graduate student, who said, here's the deal. When you graduate in film school, nobody's going to want to look at your stupid student film. They want to read your screenplays, because they turn to the film schools for writers, not for directors, at the start of the whole process. So you better get to work writing 3 good screenplays by the time you graduate from here. That did at least soak in somewhat, but I just didn't get that much in my years there. And I know you got a lot, I think, out of the UCLA course that you took with Corey Mandel. Can you say a few things about that? When that was probably like 5 or 6 years ago, you did those courses?
Well, yeah, the truth is, like, a lot of times universities hire people who are good at doing something, but they don't necessarily talk to them about whether or not they understand how to teach.
Yeah.
And understand that that's a completely different discipline that you need to be aware of to actually be a good professor. And years after,
Jen, why are you laughing?
Look, that just doesn't resonate with me at all. I don't know what you're talking about, Greg. Never come across that as a university academic.
Well, so there you go. Yeah, I'd come out of a training background and I worked in the government before I went to USC. And, where the onus was on me to keep people interested in an 8-hour course for 5 days straight. So I was very aware of the fact that there was a different dynamic going on in classrooms. And it took me a while, but yeah, years after USC, I found a guy named Corey Mandel who teaches in Los Angeles, but he also teaches a bunch of stuff online. And he had done the work to go from being a writer to understanding writing. He really has broken it down into he teaches people how to write, not what to write. He doesn't give a crap about what you write. You can write, but he is kind of a master at showing people how to write an effective scene and then building from there. And I was just kind of blown away by the difference.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because as you took those courses, you took several levels with him, right?
Yep.
And then, Greg and I talk basically at least once a week for the most part for 25 years, usually about surfing. We going surfing this week, you're going to get in the water, you're going to go here, there. That's the first half of the conversation. But then eventually other stuff starts to come up. And that's what began coming up was, this course that I'm taking with this guy, Corey Mandel, it's really good. It's really, so it's not like Greg sitting here trying to sell it for him or anything like that. It's just that I remember over the course of probably 2 or 3 years, you took those courses and you kept saying it's helping me in the editing suite. Also helps you, I think, at times to articulate when you're trying to explain to other people what's going on with story structure, is the more you get a handle of that kind of vocabulary and language. Matt, can you join us here? I know you must have a question by now. Jump in. You just read the Bruce Block. You got a thought?
Yes, I did. Yeah, you made me read it, Randy, and I thank you, thank you so much. It's funny, like the first 2/3 of the book, I'm reading it, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, okay, this is like basically the stuff they've like taught us in like every cinematography class, like our every photography 101 class. Like, okay, yeah, this is great. Okay, fine. And then I got to the last third, and it was like my brain caught on fire. Like, why haven't they told us this? Like, why? Well, who's been keeping this a secret all these years? I felt that kind of feeling that, like, I'd been in film school. I'd been given like like a box of tools. I'd been given a pile of lumber. I'd been given nails, hammers, whatever, and then told to go build a house. But no one had ever given me an actual blueprint to build a house before. So I was so happy to have like actually read that. And Jason, you're saying that there are directors that you're trying to talk about the 7 elements to them, and they're like, whatever. Like, who are these directors? Where are they coming from?
Well, I'm not naming any names.
Please name names.
You know, there's all
Blow it up, Jay. Come on.
What's that? Sorry.
Blow it up.
Yeah,
Let
sure.
it go.
You know, there's all types of directors out there. I mean, there's directors who know everything about lenses and nothing about the human condition. And there are directors who know everything about sort of, you know, observational human moments and couldn't tell you what a 32 millimeter lens was. And some people think that whatever their approach to directing is enough, that it's instinctual, that it's intrinsic, that it's their talent. But I think to be a good director and to be a versatile director and to be a working director, there's no end to the education of understanding not only all of the art forms that preceded it that sort of coalesce into filmmaking, but also these things that Bruce is talking about, these visual elements that are universal within any frame, within any story that's told visually, that if you did control it, if you did make conscious choices, you would have more of a command as a director. You know, it's kind of like I was teaching a class on eye lines, and I was saying that the angle of the eye line from the action line. So imagine there's an action line between two people who are talking to each other, right? So, you know, on a 180-degree line, one side of it, you're on one side of the line. The angle from that line, what the eye line is never arbitrary. It always has an emotional value, whether you choose to control the eye line or not. And it's the same with color. It's the same with line. It's the same with space. The fact that you're not controlling it is your own loss. So I don't know.
Well, and to that very point, you know, the last section of Bruce Block's book is titled "Don't Go Crazy." Jason, pick up on that. What does he mean by that heading,
Randy? I don't recall. What is? I mean, I'm assuming.
Come on. That's what we lived and breathed at film school. What you got to see there at times were some of these rich kids who their parents gave them all the money in the world to make a film, and therefore they went out and rented cranes and dollies and every piece of equipment, and their whole film was going crazy of the camera spinning in circles and like, look at these shots we made. And then there's no narrative arc or whatever to it, and it's just, you know, just noise after a while.
I think it was in Bruce's class where he said you're going to show up. This is, I think, to your point, you're going to show up on set on your first job as a television director, and you're going to say, okay, so we've got this sweeping crane shot that comes down, and the Steadicam operator is on the crane, and he steps off the crane, and he does a 360 around the actors, and the producers are going to say, no, you're going to get a master, and then you're going to get an over and an over, and then we're going to do the next scene. But the point of it is that within the master and within the over, it's like what Peter Roth, who was a production executive who ran Warner Brothers Television for many years, said to me when I gave a way too fancy, too crazy show and tell for a pilot. He pulled me aside after, and he said, "Just remember that television is a script and a close-up. But it's what you do with that close-up. It's how you light that close-up. It's the color within the close-up. It's the eye line in the close-up that communicates the story." So I think that's what you mean.
Yeah, that's exactly that's awesome. That is it's really great. Greg, do you see that with some of the directors in documentary stuff where they trying to go crazy with or the cinematographers trying to go crazy with the camera work and not even understanding? I know one of the films that I shot, I had a really veteran music video director who every scene that we got ready to do, I would walk in and he would have the camera up in the corner of the room or something like that with this amazing shot. And I would have to veto it and say, that's an amazing shot, but we're telling an overarching story for this entire movie here. And it doesn't fit in with, I've got the vision as a director, the whole story. You're just going one shot at a time, not knowing. And all of which leads into Bruce Bloch's main point, which I think, Matt, is what you're talking about, which is that he goes through the 7 elements and then his last section before that last little kind of epilogue at the end. But his whole last part is about all this stuff has to serve the narrative. That was what he said to us in that course over and over again. Everything must be in service to the narrative. It must all be moving towards this progression of the story that we're telling and eventually building to that. And I think that's where sometimes if you've got a cinematographer that hasn't really digested what the story is, they're off on their own. You run into that sometimes, Jason, the virtuoso cinematographer that wants to do individual shots that aren't connected with the story?
Yeah, all the time, which is why you as a director have to communicate what the central idea of the narrative is. It's not just the shape of the narrative, it's also what are we saying? It doesn't matter how great your action scenes are or how great your shots are. If the idea of the movie is small, you will make a small movie. Big movies come from big ideas. So even if you look at Ordinary People, which is the great Bruce Bloch example, it seems like a very small movie, but it's about holding on to your pain. It's about not releasing. It's about rigidity. It's about losing love. It's about big ideas. And when you know what it's about, the central idea, in addition to the shape of the narrative, then you can stop a crazy DP from going off and doing something that has nothing to do with either of those things.
And you're teaching these days a little bit with use some of the stuff?
Yeah, some of it. I taught during the pandemic. I taught for a school in Colorado, and I've been teaching sort of living room classes for the last 6 years. That's just mostly writers who want to direct, who know nothing about anything we're talking about, and we just sort of break down movies, or we take an idea. How to shoot a dinner table scene, or how to shoot a courtroom scene, or eye lines, it always comes back to eye lines. And we talk about these visual elements, in a much more casual way with a lot of alcohol.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Fun.
Sign me up.
We got about 5 minutes left here. We're winding down. Jen, you got one more uninformed question to ask these guys?
Yeah, look, it's totally uninformed, but I'm just interested, obviously, with focusing really on narrative and on the visuals here. And it just makes me think about this trend now to try and exploit a whole lot of the other senses. So I'm sure Australia is not the only ones that now there's lots of movies you can go and see in 4DX cinemas. So you've got smells and you've got, water coming down on you and, all these things. And I kind of wonder, is that just a bit of a cheap shot that we really shouldn't need if the visuals and the narrative were strong enough? Or does it really add to somebody's sense of kind of transportation into the narrative if they are feeling the rain on their skin and they are, smelling the smells? I'm interested in that kind of contrast.
Jason?
Handball.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you?
Well, you're talking about, like, there's some theaters now that are actually pumping smells into the theater during a scene. And
yeah. So if I go and see a film, and there's, there's gases being pumped out, so you smell what's meant to be happening in the scene. And if it's raining in the scene, you've also got water coming on you. Is it really sad that we've got to that point that we think the visuals and the narrative aren't strong enough to really immerse someone in what's going on? Or are you guys in support of trying to exploit these other senses? I'm just wondering, as filmmakers, where you sit, because I sort of wonder if we need that or not.
Well, that just sounds like an amusement park ride and not a cinematic experience where you're a viewer who was showing up with your emotion ready to be torn asunder in one way or another. It's different than if the seats start to shake. Now all of a sudden it's about the physical experience, not the emotional experience. I mean, I guess you could say there's some emotion going on because you're wet but I don't know. That just feels like an amusement park ride.
Yeah.
I think, that kind of stuff will happen, but at the end of the day, if that occurs and something actually lasts, like there's an experience that people go through and they remember 20 years later, there will still be a great story at the heart of that experience.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of the conservative element to it in terms of non-change over time. In the 90s, there was a whole big movement, excitement over interactive storytelling and the idea that you could choose your own pathway in a story. And I think what they found out was, as you're sort of saying, Jason, most audiences come in just wanting to be told a story. Just tell me a story. I want the omniscient narrator. I want the narrator who's knows how to do this stuff, is a good storyteller, knows how to manipulate my emotions to make me feel something. And it breaks down when the narrator has not got those skills, but it's at its finest when it is that. And I think that storytelling is unchanged and largely, despite all the technology and everything else like that. It's still the same basic thing. In the 90s, with the information explosion in the 80s, a lot of people thought, oh, this is the end of hierarchical storytelling and that kind of stuff. Well, sorry, movies are still happening the same basic way. I don't see any signs of that changing in the near future. And I think it all tracks back to what's at the core of our course, which is this idea of narrative structure being programmed into the brain, this basic ABT dynamic. It's there. It's how the brain works. It selects that kind of material that matches. What you're talking about with the smells, I mean, that was tried in the 1950s, literally smell-o-vision and all kinds of things. They experiment with all those things. And they came along, and the Cinerama Dome, is just finally being closed. I think it went broke in the last month or two or something like that. And on Sunset Boulevard, we all went to film school going to the Cinerama Dome, which they'd kind of revitalized for a while there. But that was one of the cutting edge places of giant format films that came along in the 50s and CinemaScope and everything else. A lot of that stuff, they continue to, it's basically the same thing as natural selection. There's a selection process that goes on. People experiment, they try and broaden it out and explore the boundaries, but in the end, keeps coming back to the same basic form. And movies are still mostly 90 to 120 minutes. They're still not that changed over the course of a century. So that, I think, all comes back to the brain programming not changing despite information overload and those kinds of things. Matt, you got, Jason.
I also think it has to do with how much we are expecting, how much as an audience, how do I say this? It's a question of how much work the audience is being asked to do. And when you're coming in to watch a movie, the work that you're doing, again, like I said, is spiritual, it's emotional. Maybe if it's a mystery, it's about, guessing ahead or trying to figure something out. But when you're asking people to absorb the smell or absorb the rain or to be interactive and choose the story, now it's too much work. I didn't show up to do any work. I showed up to be taken on a journey.
Yeah.
You do the work.
Which is exactly the challenge. Well, actually, this sets the stage for 2 weeks from now. We're going to talk about this Seaspiracy documentary that has been on Netflix. And I'm going to draw the comparison with My Octopus Teacher. And, all my ocean conservation people wrote to me all upset about Seaspiracy, thinking that it was this giant cutting edge movie that all of America was talking about. And I checked in with a few of my major filmmaker friends in Hollywood, and they just said, nobody's talking about Seaspiracy. They're still talking about My Octopus Teacher. That was a piece of wonderful entertainment that drew the audience in, that they loved, and they didn't have to do a ton of work on. And Seaspiracy was this informational, controversial thing, yada, yada. Michael Moore figured out a long time ago that the news stuff still needs an element of entertainment added to it to make it palatable for the audiences. So we'll be getting into that, but I think that parallels what you're saying there, is that audiences, they still show up for the same main reason, to be entertained and pulled in and given an experience. This is pretty much about as much as we have. We could go on for a few hours. You guys are awesome, and there's so much we can talk about. I'm going to hopefully segue from this in July or so and have Bruce Block on as a guest, and I'll check back with you guys, see if you got some specific questions to craft for him, because it'll be fun to talk with him. And he's really, just an icon in terms of what he's done for 35 years there and laid down all this foundation of visual storytelling. On that note, Greg, you got any final words of wisdom for us?
I really don't. Thanks for having me on, Randy.
And Jason, your
I
final
have,
words of
I
wisdom?
have a question for Bruce Block, which is, and I wonder, I'll read the end of his book, but the don't go crazy. I also wonder if it can apply to the book itself. In other words, I have seen directors over prep. I have seen them over design. I have seen them, take the trick of Bruce Block's incredible, what he lays out is that you also have to know how to apply it so that you still have room on the day to move and to be malleable and let reality impose itself. And I've seen certain people come in and literally go crazy with the kind of visual language preparation that what they shoot is completely rigid and not alive.
Well, and we deal with that exact parallel with the ABT framework over and over and over again, which is probably the most common question we get is, okay, we got the and, but therefore for one paragraph, for a synopsis or an abstract. Now, how do we use it for a 10-page essay? And the answer is we can't give you a 10-page template to fill in the blanks. We can give you the 3 words, for one paragraph or for your pitch line or something, but you have to work with that and develop the intuition eventually where you can take it beyond that. And then the last thing to say on that, the little example I like to use for people is that for the game of chess, there are websites that can teach you the opening 3 or 4 or 5 moves, that you can memorize, and you can open your game with these moves over and over again. But by about the 4th or 5th move, the other guy will have done something else where you'd better now have the intuition to start playing the game, because we can't give you a template for 83 moves. Same basic thing. At some point, you've got to shift from the little bit of formula we can give you into the actual intuition to know what you're doing. Is that the same things that you're saying, sort of?
Yeah, and it's what Frank Danielle talks about, which is something I love that he used to talk about, was the difference between critical thinking and creative thinking, right? That if all you're doing is critical thinking and you're applying more morals to your work and you're applying structure to your work, and then you're never in that creative mindset where 2 + 2 = 11. And that's where you need to be to apply the critical stuff. Like you have to have a balance of both so that it isn't rigid, so that it is alive.
Okay, why did you not start the hour with that quote instead of saving it for the very end where our minds have just exploded?
Right?
That's the best quote of the whole session. That's awesome. And that's just going to obligate you to come back again later this summer. Maybe I'll have you come back. We'll do another discussion. Yeah, Matt will be there and Jen will be there. We'll have lots more to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you guys are great. Thank you very, very much. Have yourself a wonderful day. We'll be checking in with you. And Jason, love you. Love your show. Talk to you soon.
Love Victor, June 11th on Hulu. Thank you.
Awesome.
There you go.